There are now 600 studios in India. 3 years back, there were 250, including indies.
Right.
30 studios have broken the $1 million ARR mark, which is great.
Where a lot of struggle ultimately lies is to really cross the line in terms of, hey, is this a commercially viable thing or is it more of a hobby project, which tends to be the case for a lot of developers.
Probably India has the highest number of developers even listed on the store. So I think there are about 200,000 developers listed on the Play Store. Really large number compared to other countries. Huge dev talent. But I think the challenge is that a lot of people don't have the risk appetite to self-publish. People believe that if you want to go to the US, you have to create an iOS game.
Right.
It's not true. I think Android is 35 to 40% of the US market. Two successful studios, the guys who are making more than $50 million in ad revenue or revenue in general, they're not making complex games. There are only three parts of any successful game, right? One is user acquisition, second is retention, third is monetization.
Hi everyone, good morning and welcome to Matrix Moments Gaming Edition. Vivek here joining from the gaming team, and with me here we have Ashish who's joining us, and we would love to talk about games. But Ashish, why don't we start with a brief intro about yourself and your journey?
Sure. Thanks Vivek. It's a pleasure to be here. So I spent the last 10 years in ad tech. I spent 5 years in Google. I think I did a very interesting trifecta in Google. I was part of the ad network team, AdMob, AdSense, so worked with a lot of publishers and game developers and B2B partners as well. I was part of the Google Play team, and I was part of actually launching RMG on the Play Store, the pilot that's ongoing. And I was also part of the Google ad team. So I've seen kind of like three interesting parts of Google. On a side note, I'm also an angel investor in about 20 companies. So, really like investing and the space. And most recently, since the last year, I've decided to take the entrepreneurial plunge. And right now I'm working as the co-founder at AppBroda. We're a SaaS company that basically try to help publishers and largely mobile game and app developers to help increase their monetization. So really excited to talk about anything, about the mobile app and gaming ecosystem in India.
No, fantastic. Thinking about the gaming industry, very outside in, right?
Yeah.
If you look at the broader gaming opportunity, you see headlines everywhere that it's a $150 billion market, $200 billion market.
Yeah.
But ultimately, when things boil down to what's the amount of revenue that actually countries make, you would see that there's a significant amount of disparity.
Yeah, sure.
Countries like US and China probably make about $45-50 billion, but India is way down on that pile.
Yeah.
Despite having such phenomenal engineering, product and development talent so far in India, why are we at this phase, and how does the market landscape itself really look like?
Yeah. It's really funny. I was just talking about this with a couple of my friends at Apple and Google about this, and we literally realized that very few people know the actual, landscape in terms of what's the TAM, right? So maybe if I can just like throw some numbers out there. So I think the TAM in India right now in terms of this market size, mobile gaming, is $1.5 billion, right now, like 2022, 2023. And I'll just break it down to three segments. So first is RMG, which is actually leading the way. By my estimates, roughly RMG GMV is about $10 to $12 billion. Out of that, the rake, which is what the companies actually make, is 12 to 15%. So billion dollar plus is just RMG revenue. After that comes IAP. So Indian users are spending about $500 to $600 million on mobile games, right? Like your Coin Masters, your BGMIs, and so on and so forth, right? Unfortunately, most of it is going outside to developers, not in India. Indian developers only have about 100 million out of the $600 million. And the third, which is a really interesting piece, is ads. I think ads is always looked at as like a stepchild in terms of monetization, but it's actually about $400 million. So a lot of developers are actually primarily relying on ads to earn. So if you stack these three things up, you have a $1.5 billion industry in India, which is growing really fast, but a far cry away from the $40-50 billion of, let's say, US or China, right? And to answer your question, probably India has the highest number of developers even listed on the store. So I think there are about 200,000 developers listed on the Play Store, for example, from India. Really large number compared to other countries. Huge dev talent. But I think the challenge is that a lot of people don't have the risk appetite to self-publish. Right? If you look at gaming, there are two kind of models, right? And you probably are well aware of this. You can either be a self-publisher, which is that you start your own shop and you publish your own games and you make all the money. Or the other option is you develop games. You be the coder, you be the designer, and then you sell your game, right? And the second model is kind of where India is more at, right? They build great games, but then they end up selling them to publishers in Europe or USA, and they make most of the money. So I think that change or that inflection point I feel is going to happen sometime in the next 18 months.
Hmm. No, fascinating, right? So as at Matrix, we do think about the broader gaming opportunity
Yeah.
quite a lot. And here is the broader narrative about which, and the reason really why which we are really excited about gaming, right? Phenomenally large population which is young,
Yeah.
very quickly digitizing pretty
Yeah.
much across the board. Payment rails coming in place, and the mobile gamer count estimate from an MAU perspective is anywhere between like 400 to 600 million, right?
Yeah.
Now that's the kind of DAU base that most countries cannot command.
Correct.
And given that India as an economy is expected to grow to such significant larger sizes, and given that our GDP per capita will also increase, it is reasonable to presume that our revenue itself as an industry is likely to grow, right? So that's the narrative macro that everybody gets excited about.
Yeah.
But where the lot of challenges have emerged in the last 20 years is that despite having the talent, like we talked about, the execution on high quality, globally competitive games have been challenging. One thing to call out is definitely that there has been specific innovation in various pockets in India which have done phenomenally well, right? Especially the real money gaming industry, including one of our portfolio companies, Zupi, have done phenomenally well, right? So that cohort of companies competing on financial expectations of return from users have done well and have created proper revenue pools. Probably one of the very few in consumer tech companies in the country, right? But there has been a challenge of things that you conventionally call as video games. Like gaming content that is consumed globally, that has been always a challenge. Let's probably dig into that a little bit, right? Like about the gaming ecosystem and the developers. We talked about some of the early challenges that they're facing. How do you outline the landscape of developers in general? You talked about 100,000 developers. Where are they? What are they focusing on? And what are the things that can be done in order to make their lives better?
I think that's a great question. So I'll probably break it up into a couple of parts. So one, where are these developers, right? So we've seen hubs. So for example, out of the 200,000, 50,000 are sitting in Gujarat. Right?
Fascinating.
Unexpectedly, everyone would think, Karnataka, Bangalore would be the natural answer. But if you look at specific people who are building for utilities and gaming, which is largely dependent on IAP and ad tech, it is actually Gujarat that emerges as probably the number one hub, right? Now, most of these developers are actually not building games. They're building apps or like non-gaming tools and utilities, your photo player, your image editors and so on, which is also a very large market, but they're not yet part of the gaming economy, right? And one of the challenges is that there's a lack of talent when it comes to understanding the entire life cycle of building a game. They know how to code well, but they may not know all the aspects of what creates a good game, even a casual game, right? So I think there's a learning curve gap there, right? And second, what I've seen, especially from countries like Turkey, where probably they were in a similar situation in 2017 that India is in now. They were building games that were very local to them, right? So there's a game called Oki that they built, which is a local Turkish game. Now everyone in India, if you think about gaming, they will say Ludo, because the pandemic, everyone played Ludo, right? And Ludo still contributes to almost 50% of downloads in the last year, right? So how do you make this entire developer hub actually understand that what are the genres beyond just Ludo or let's say Snake and Ladders or Carom, etc., that we have grown up playing, right? The second thing is that a lot of people have moved to RMG, like you already mentioned, is again because it's a product market fit, right? So I don't feel that India gaming is behind in that sense. If you look at RMG, like probably India is one of the leading countries in the world in RMG, right? Now, why RMG? Why people said, hey, Indians will not pay, this is like something that is never going to happen. But RMG just came in and surprised everyone. And they said, look, Indians are going to pay. And Indians are going to pay a lot of money because there's a product market fit. Because I think somewhere it's ingrained that people like being competitive, they like playing, like Zupi games or like Ludo for not just for fun, but also for money, right? Third problem, when you spoke about your conventional video games, right? Let's look at a couple of genres. Let's look at casual gaming or hyper casual gaming. It's exploded for two reasons. One, there's a lot of knowledge capital available in Western markets and maybe in China that is not available in India. See, you have to understand that this space at the end of it is probably run by 2,500 developers globally. So if you look at the publishing model of gaming, right, it's not that there are many creators. There are many developers, but there are very few publishers. So if you look at Zynga, or if you look at like a Rollic or like a Take-Two Interactive, which is one of the largest publishers of the world, their strategy is, okay, I find a game which is suddenly becoming hot, it's growing. How do I acquire that game and put it under my portfolio, right? So there are these 2,000, 3,000 companies that are actually owning the ecosystem, and they're black boxing the information. Right? So now if I'm a new developer, I'm 21 years old, from India, I want to create a hyper casual game. I know how to build a game, but I don't know the business and economics of self-publishing a game, right? I think that knowledge capital is restricting a lot of people from going into conventional gaming. So that's why RMG has become more like you speak to a developer today, they'll be like, yaar, main RMG game bana dunga, right? Because they understand how that works. It's simple, money in, money out. I made a Ludo game, I've made a Fruit Ninja game, I've copied it, and that's it. But if you ask them, can you make a new casual game? They actually don't know the unit economics. They don't know how do I make UAC, like how do I make the user acquisition? What should my D7 be? What should my LTV be? What should my CPM be? How do I get advertisers? All these, knowledge gaps, it's available in US, it's available in EMEA, it's available in China. I think it's just trickling into India, right? And I think a lot of it is also to do with platform dependencies that like Apple and Google and Meta.
Yeah.
Every developer is kind of reliant on them. And until Google literally tells them this is how to do it, like this is the playbook, they're not able to get there, right? So I think these are the 2-3 problems that I currently see why conventional gaming has not grown, but RMG has sort of really grown very, very well.
Fascinating, right? So I think it might be instructive to dive a little bit deeper into the business models of gaming itself and the unit economics, right? So we have seen traditional pay-to-purchase premium games for the longest period of time up until like 2010-11. They were pretty much de facto what the industry really stood for, right? Buy a game once and then you sort of enjoy the experience for a very long period of time. As a side anecdote, it has been the case that India always had a latent gaming market, which is always in the grey zones. People playing video games which are completely pirated and playing them on PCs and consoles, right? So estimates vary anywhere from 10 to 15 million people having been done there and growing up with the Western gaming experience, right? So from an experience perspective, the audience is expecting global quality, right? And increasingly becoming so, especially as things are becoming more and more democratized. Now, if you really dial back and think about what essentially changed from 2011-12, it is essentially the arrival of the App Store economy and freemium, right? The distribution suddenly did not get restricted to traditional consoles, things that you have to buy in order to play a game, and now you have actual mobile phones that you're carrying around doing a bunch of other things, but you could also fill in your empty time with games, right? And at the same time, the innovation that really gaming brought about was taking the idea of giving away your core product for free,
right?
And then generating value from in-app purchases and transactions, which is purely user opt-in and what we like to call as the freemium model, right? Now within freemium itself, over a period of time, as you mentioned, the publishers really came on and then really aggregated value, right? But outside in, it feels like that's the real democratization of the games industry, right? The ability to distribute my games at very large scale without really having to spend a lot of marginal cost in distributing that. That just seems like a phenomenal unlock that happened in 2012.
Absolutely,
right? How is that changing right now, and how is that model evolving right now from the 2012 to current time, which has been de facto?
Right? I think that's a really interesting question. Democratization was amazing, and if you rode that curve then, you reaped a lot of benefits, right? Because if you were one of the early people who cracked the model of how to leverage the store at that time wanted you, right, as a content creator, to kind of boost you because it was a mutual partnership. Now fast forward to maybe 10 or 11 years later, where de facto app and play stores are the way of distribution. I think there are some cons of the democratization because it is unfortunately restricted to 2 platforms, right? So now these platforms are also realizing how do we make max money out of the publishers that are now dependent on our platform, right? And we're seeing the tussle, right? We're seeing the tussle in India with the Play Store fees, for example, right? And that tussle is ongoing, right? So publishers are saying, hey, hang on, we got this opportunity to publish for free, we got users for free, we got them to pay, you helped us do all of this, but now you're asking, in their opinion, an inordinate amount of money for what they feel they're adding value, right? Which is their content, their gameplay that is going out, or their content that is going out. So I think this democratization has helped create this industry. So I think all kudos to the platforms that did it. But I think there needs to be now a middle ground. There needs to be a figuring out of a way of how do platforms work with publishers whose unit economics do not match what they think the unit economics should have been. So to break this down, right, like a store typically takes 30% of every in-app purchase. Same on the ad side. For every ad shown, an ad network takes about 30 to 33% of the revenue. Is that sustainable for a publisher in today's day and age? Not always, right? So tomorrow, if the store says, hey, I want to create 1 million more creators, is it really going to happen?
Hmm.
Right? So I'll give you an example of the web world. The web had a WordPress moment. So if you think of today, I want to create a blog, you can just go to WordPress and you can create a blog in probably a day. Today, you cannot create a game in that easy amount of time, right? It'll take you like a few $1,000s and maybe a 2-3 month commitment to even create a hyper casual game. So today, the number of creators in the ecosystem is very limited, right? So while the store has democratized distribution, the unit economics right now are not really opening up like a million creators. So I don't think we've seen the TikTokization or the Instagramization or the YouTubeization of this ecosystem. Now imagine a world where 1 million people can create games. I think that there will be tools that you can do it quickly. There will be lower costs that you can do it. And I think the store itself will figure out that, hey, hang on, right now I have 5,000 or 10,000 people contributing 80% of downloads. What if I have a million people that actually help me reach out to more people coming to my store? And I think that's maybe a little bit of the future where I think the stores also need to think that, yeah, is 30% really a fair amount? Because if you look at where the stores are reaching now, they're reaching into developing nations.
Yeah.
If you look at developed nations, they're okay with this model because the unit economics, the LTVs work out. But for the developing nations like India, Nigeria, Brazil, 30% is probably too sharp a cut to give to the stores to build a viable business model, right? So I think this is a very interesting time, coming from the democratization of stores, which was a big boom. But now I think there needs to be a middle ground or at least a localization, if not a middle ground. And maybe a one fit model doesn't work because in the US you already have the model working. But I think stores need to figure out a way to work with game developers here.
Fair enough. So on the freemium bit, right? Just for the benefit of everyone, what essentially happens is because the game is free to access and play, pretty much most of the users end up not really having to pay, and that number goes as high as 98%, 99%, right? So let's say a game acquires 100 users. You're lucky if you're able to convert 1.5 to 2% of that entire user base. And even in that, again, the Pareto distribution supply, and you will likely make most amount of money from a very small number of users, right? So what happened over a period of the last 5 to 7 years were the developers themselves started realizing that these power laws exist, and it is important to find whales who will spend disproportionately in your game in order to sort of make the economics work, right? So beyond the platform fees that eats into your cost, beyond the fact that you have to actually service 99 users who will actually not pay,
right?
You are having to pay now additionally in order to figure out ways to get your app to multiple number of users, right? So traditionally, even though the app stores themselves exist as surfaces where apps can be discovered, it is not easy to do when supply is 10,000 games coming out every month.
Right? Absolutely.
So then suddenly the reliance started coming in on performance marketing, and then the whale hunting business really began, right? Do you want to sort of dial back and walk through how that journey was? A lot of craziness and money went into this whole business, right? How do you look at that?
I think, look, I think of this as a world where, let's say there were more stores, right? Coming to my segueing from the earlier point, then whatever you said would actually not have happened, right? The way that today users are being acquired, right? And like you rightly said, 97% of users that are being acquired, and bear in mind those are probably being paid for,
right?
Like you're paying for every download or 80% of downloads. You don't know if you're going to get the money back, right? So I think to answer your question, the problem is the same. If you imagine a world where you had 20 stores where I could publish my game, and I knew that I had 10% of traffic coming from each store would actually have to fight harder to prove the value of a user that they're giving to me. So think of it like a Walmart, right? Like if it's only Walmart, they have all the negotiating power. A user that is coming, they don't really care if that user is actually going to buy the good or not, because the user has no other place to go but Walmart, right? So here we are seeing, and further in like maybe mid 20, last decade, we saw further black boxization of the user acquisition tools also, right? And without taking names, like that made it very hard to even prove transparent attribution. So today, let's say XYZ developer has to acquire a user whom he or she believes is a high paying user. He or she actually cannot prove that this is a high paying user until they come in and do the whole journey in their app, right? And these tools, I think, while again they were great for the boom of getting users in the whole freemium model, now again we're seeing the challenge on all gaming companies, seeing the challenge on LTV, saying, yeah, I'm not sure that the user I paid for in like 2020 is worth like $10, but I probably paid $8 for him, right? And I just think that if you had more stores, this problem won't exist.
Hmm.
So the unlock for the previous question or this question, right, and the challenges that have existed are germinated in the fact that the dependency on 2 or 3 stores is causing the entire problem,
Hmm.
right? So if you look at Korea, they actually have a store which is not just the Play Store, and that's really good for the ecosystem because there the Play Store is supposed to compete with this localized store.
Hmm.
Now, if you had a store in India, like you had Indus OS on Samsung, right, and acquired by PhonePe. Now, if they were able to reach a scale which is competing at some level with the Google, then Google has to fight harder to prove value of user acquisition to the game developer,
Hmm.
right? So I think this, this whole problem is kind of stuck in that where else do you go,
Right.
right? And I think that is also a great opportunity for a startup,
Yeah.
right? Like where else do you go? There should be a place to go,
Hmm.
right? These platforms are amazing, but more opportunity for game developers means these stores have to fight harder to prove value to the game developers
Hmm.
also. I think right now the last 10 years the relationship has become very one-sided,
Hmm.
right? Increasingly, right? And that is my fear also. Like as an objective player in the ecosystem, our fear is that you only have 2 or 3 platforms to really make your entire business out of,
Hmm.
and that's never good for any business,
Right.
right? So
No, fair enough, right? On a slightly more optimistic note, if I'm looking at the industry right now, it is still growing at a phenomenal pace,
yeah,
right? Despite being in hundreds of billions of dollars, it's still growing at a reasonable enough pace, even though the growth seems to be maturing. Enough developers are able to break out and then create truly remarkable
yeah,
experiences, right? And this
yeah,
is happening across game content formats. We have had Monopoly Go recently come out from Scopely, which was a
right,
phenomenal success. And at the same time, we had BattleBit come out on Steam, which was made by a team of 4 developers,
yeah,
right? Both reaching astounding degrees of success. So, as a player, it doesn't feel like there has been a better time to be
right,
in gaming and to be playing
true,
games, right?
true,
Uh, how does this eventually progress as we take this forward 2 or 3 years down the line, right?
yeah,
Now the player expectations are high.
mm,
We have high fidelity devices in which complex games can be played, and we have seen the journey of
yeah,
PUBG and shooter games even in markets like India and Latam, right?
correct, correct,
Phenomenal successes. What really comes next,
yeah,
right? Is it really going to be coming in more from these larger developers, or how do new and
yeah.
upcoming gaming companies and startups really start thinking about what is the best way to approach this?
Yeah, I love that question. And I was slightly contrarian point of view. While I think the quality of games has increased tremendously, I think the best thing about gaming is that even very simple games which may not look very sophisticated
Hmm.
are very popular, right? And like hyper casual or casual as a category, you can play it with one hand, and those are not very sophisticated games. Like you might look at the game art and say, maybe this was like it's not as sophisticated as it could be, but you'll have millions of people playing it and loving it, not
Right.
just playing it, they'll be sharing it with their friends and they'll be playing it in a social manner, right? So I feel there's going to be much more content creation, right? And I'll take if you look at parallel from web, the problem with the web is it's a very concentrated store. If you're not in the top 5 results, you don't really have a business,
Right.
right? So if you're a PDF editor, you're not in the top 10, you that's it, like you're done. There's no other way of actually getting users. But if you're a game creator entering the game economy and saying, I have a cool idea, I want to build a game, like we had the studio in Mumbai, they built an ASMR game, right? Soap cutter,
Right.
right? And uh, that is just such an innovative idea. It was the first time I heard of something called an ASMR, and that was soap cutter game. I think it blew up in Christmas time. They got like some 20 million downloads in 1 week.
Hmm.
So the reason they could do that is because unlike web, the channels of distribution to actually acquire users even onto one singular store is huge.
Hmm.
You don't rely on SEO. In gaming, you don't have SEO. Sure, if you have an Angry Birds or a Monopoly IP titles, you have SEO. But every day we see new games being published and millions of downloads happening.
Hmm.
Right? So as a game developer, that's very exciting, unlike the web ecosystem, where your biggest fear is, hey, I can make better content than the guy who's probably number one, but how do I get to number one is really hard in a web ecosystem. In the game ecosystem, you can make a high-end game, which can take a long time and a lot of money, but you can also create a very low-end game and get like millions of users. I think as a game developer, as long as you know how to code, you know the right tools, you can actually build a really good game in under $10,000 in India, right? Truly, like I built a game in $1,000. It took me 35 days, and it was a very basic game, but I felt excited as a creator that I created a game, right? So I think that moment, and someone told me this, I was speaking to recently someone who teaches gaming. They said that from a study they did, 5% of all people who play games actually at some point want to create a game.
Right.
Right. So I think that is the really, really exciting, optimistic part of gaming, is that it is not dependent on like things like SEO. Right. It is content. I think it's much more like Instagram or like YouTube or like TikTok. You don't know who's gonna go hot tomorrow. You don't know who's gonna go viral tomorrow. It's like a movie business, right? Like suddenly a RRR will come out. There's no like scientific logic behind it. And then the question though that comes is that, okay, can this person who created that first hit, can he or she create the second hit? And I think that's where, the unit economics, the data science models and all kind of need to build in to kind of make the developer say, okay, I can build a really big business out of this. Right. So I would say that for all developers out there, create your first few games, learn about the ecosystem, but then if you want to make a business out of it, that's the really hard part of it, right? But the moat is not very hard.
Right.
Right. Like I think of it as literally, like I've said this many times on this talk, but like I think it's like TikTok.
Right.
Pick up a phone, create a video, you don't know if it's going to go viral. Gaming is going to boil down to that. I think there'll be games published in 2 weeks, right? And there'll be platforms coming up which will say, okay, I'll publish your game. And, like Steam, for example, like that kind of what it does. And suddenly if it goes hot, you suddenly realize, okay, wait a minute, I need to quit my day job and this might become my full-time career.
Talking about folks who take this one step further,
Yeah.
serious entrepreneurs who really
Yeah.
want to take it like as a commercial shot, right? I think the point that you mentioned is really what ultimately sits at the bottom of all fears for all entrepreneurs and even investors for that
Yeah.
matter, right? The fact that games feel like a hits and misses driven business.
Sure.
It feels like a movie blockbuster roulette where you're just spinning the wheel and you might end up with a hit,
Yeah.
and if yes, you're lucky, and if not, then well, good luck. Right?
Yeah.
Is there a way or an alternate path
Yeah.
where somebody can take a scientific shot at the space and think about it and break down the problem into multiple components and then figure out a way to systematically build a commercially viable gaming business? How does that playbook look like?
I'm glad you asked that, and I think this is where the platforms actually play a really critical role. There are only 3 parts of any successful game, right? One is user acquisition, second is retention, third is monetization. Each part actually requires just a good level of data science and execution. We've seen this in studios in India. The 2 successful studios, the guys who are making more than $50 million in ad revenue or revenue in general, they're not making complex games. They've actually, I would say, to a level, copied games that have been popular in the West.
They're making word games and mastery games.
Word games and mastery games, you said it, right? So those are not like a creative boom or a creative disruption that they've created something that is like, wow, this was never seen before, right? What they've done really well from whatever we've studied, they've actually built really good data science teams. They've built really good A/B testing, right? So they've done the post creation part really, really well, right? So in each element, so in user acquisition, they figured out, okay, should I use a Facebook ad? Should I use a Google ad? And usme bhi there are only few elements, like what keyword should I target? What creative should I do? Right? If I get 10% more click-through rate on this creative, that actually makes a massive difference. Then they'll move to engagement and say, okay, how do I improve my D7? Today my D7 is 22%. Can I get it to 26%? Then they move to monetization. Now in monetization, I think you alluded to this earlier. They found their high paying cohorts. It might just be a few thousand people who end up paying a lot for that particular game or whose value for advertisers is very high, and they can make $1 million from just that cohort. So then they'll hyper focus on that cohort. Now what happens is that if you look at the 3 parts, if you get a 10% increment in every part versus the other guy who's built the same game, you have a very big flywheel. Because what happens is in these categories, most of the money is pumped back into user acquisition. Now the guy who's not done these 3 flywheels, he is having to pay, let's say, 10 rupees for an install. This person can afford to pay 15 rupees for an install. So most of the traffic is going to him. Eventually this guy is going to lose his business. This guy is going to come on top, right? So data science, and here I would say companies like Google, companies like AppsFlyer, companies like Apple have built absolutely amazing tools where you don't have to, as a developer, invest a lot of money, but you can use these free tools like Firebase for analytics, or you have your Play Store and your App Store data that are there, and actually say, okay, I can understand how to A/B test and build these data science models. I don't need to hire someone really expensive or like outsource it to someone else. So we've seen studios of less than 10 people make the kind of money they have just because they've iterated very step by step, saying, okay, look at this data today and like do this test. And I think that's the recipe. And this is not something that is localized to India. We've seen this. We work with European publishers. The ones who are good in the top 1%, if you talk to them, what is really the secret sauce? It boils down to data science. It is just data science.
It feels like from my conversations with global publishers who have managed to break out despite all the odds, right? One theme that has consistently stuck on is their pace of iteration and their commitment to the process itself rather than being married to their ideas, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times, and it's not to call out the fact that very vision driven game makers do not really succeed. That's certainly not the case. But folks who have been able to rigorously win at this market generally have been very iterative in this process, right? So fascinating insight there. Maybe
if you don't mind, Vik, I'd love to know, because you spoke about, as a developer, and we're obviously as a SaaS player, but as an investor, like, the hits and misses business is not really a business that investors typically like, right? I mean, my understanding is they like things to be logically there. It's like investing in a movie. If I come to you with a script and say, Vivek, do you want to invest in my script? You might say, man, this could be a hit or a miss.
Right.
And I feel I've seen the same with games. Like, a lot of publishers say, man, I think I have a good game idea. I think I have a good team, but I'm not getting funding. What is a VC's take on this hits and misses kind of ecosystem?
No, I think that's a fair question and something that we contemplate very deeply and discuss between each other. So broadly, as I previously talked about, right, we are fairly convinced about the market opportunity being there, not just for India, not just for games to be made and consumed in India, but for games to be made in India and then exported to a global market, right? This is an industry which is extremely capital efficient, right? You don't need a substantial amount of capital to sort of begin with. But then if you're able to hit the right notes, you would be able to hit a breakout success and then scale into a very large outcome, both from a balance sheet perspective and as well as from a user retention perspective, right? You've seen phenomenal businesses being made in Turkey and all the other markets that we talked about. Now, there is no real reasons why that playbook cannot happen in India. But I guess where a lot of the challenges have remained is the process of innovation and how to sort of break away the problems that exist in terms of talent availability in design. How do you figure out what are top-down opportunities to sort of go after? Do I just make yet another Ludo game, or do other white space opportunities exist, right? So there is significant amount of information asymmetry. There is this lack of understanding of fundamental design principles. And there is a lack of risk appetite for unknown or slightly away business models, which might not be very comfortable or intuitively known because that's not part of your local markets, right? So if you look at companies based out of Istanbul, they are no longer making games for Turkish audience. They don't even have teams in global markets, but pretty much 90% of their revenue is coming from global markets, right? Now, a lot of that is being fed by these extremely agile product and data science teams, which are able to iterate very quickly, right? So if we look at the companies in the Indian ecosystem which are doing extremely well in gaming, have done breakout successes, you would see at least some of these patterns emerge, right? Very analytically rigorous, creatively focusing on iteration more than being married to an idea, and getting their product out quickly and then putting that feedback loop back into the ecosystem so that in a way that their flywheel keeps on going, not just in terms of the amount of games that they put out, but also in terms of the service that they provide to the user after the user is acquired, right? Which is where live service becomes really such an important fact. So to the question, how do we look at this space? We definitely think that given the right team, right? And when I say the right team, it is a right game team which composes of all these various folks who can really pull off this game, right? And ultimately it boils down to the right sort of production crew, the right sort of business and product crew, and the right sort of design folks, right?
So very much the founders first matrix.
Very much founders first in this case,
which makes sense, which makes a lot of sense.
So I think that passion for gaming absolutely needs to be there, and a view on what works and not works, not necessarily from a utopian perspective, but from the fact that this is a market that is stewed by corpses, so to speak. And you have to be a very rigorous person to sort of crack this market, right? Beyond that, what really makes us excited about this space is the very fact that a small amount of capital early on can be extended much more given the new technology changes that are happening right now, right? Content creation is becoming an order of magnitude easier. Thanks to the UGC platforms and game engines have done a phenomenal job. Shout out to the Unity and Unreal folks here. But at the same time, now with generative AI and technologies like that coming in, a lot of barriers to entry that you might have conventionally had, lack of access to, let's say, concept art resources, or lack of access to specific coding resources. A lot of those barriers are now starting to come down, right? Market appetite still is there. Developer ecosystem is building out. And we clearly see enough amount of intent from fellow VC firms and capital allocators to spend in this industry
Yeah,
and help this grow from a long-term perspective, right?
got it.
So we definitely are thinking about it from the long-term horizon. Can you build a game which really stands the test of time and becomes a commercially viable business over a period of 5 to 7 years and not a flash in a pan
Not a
wonder,
flash
right?
ban, yeah.
So I think that is what necessarily we are looking for, to folks to have that commercial lens at the same time that you think about delivering fun to players, right?
Yeah.
Because it is ultimately essential for you to manage as a games
Sure.
business. So we're really looking for the combination of those factors. But ultimately, I guess the industry, like you said, right, it's roughly about 2 billion right now. It's nowhere close to the entire potential that it has.
Right.
No real reason it shouldn't be a 10 to 15 billion industry by 2030.
Yeah, I think just speaking on that, I really love what you said, and I agree with you. I think the ingredients all adding up. I think for the last 5 years, they've kind of been incrementally adding up. I really feel like now is the time when, the talent, the tool realization, the tool usage, the understanding of unit economics is kind of happening. I think one of the key things that probably retrospectively one has to look back as a game developer, the mistake that I feel was made, too much focus was given on localization. So recently we spoke to someone from a gaming PM from a leading gaming studio who shared that the difference between a US ARPDAU, average revenue per daily active user, which is the standard metric in gaming, versus an Indian ARPDAU is 10x, right? And one has to realize that you're competing with companies who are globally trying to acquire audiences. So if they already have a 10x ARPDAU cohort, they can afford to burn money in India and acquire users where you cannot.
Yeah.
Right. And I think this was a big insight that in the last 5 years, we saw 95% of gaming developers focusing on 100% acquisition from India. Now, they never got the flywheel effect of ARPDAU. Right? If they had 20% of their revenue or 30% coming from the US, they could then invest that money into other areas, other games, and so on and so forth. I think this realization, this single realization, is something that I think if the market now knows, everyone that is successful, we are seeing is just saying, okay, right now let's park or put India on ice in terms of user acquisition. Let's do it in Norway. Let's do it in Sweden. Let's do it in USA. Right? Because they're realizing that the ARPDAU, their difference is so high, both on IAP as well as ads, that the India story will play out organically, but not yet. Not this year.
Right.
Like this year, you will not expect an India CPM to suddenly go from like 20 cents to like $1. It's just not going to happen. Right. So if you keep investing in India, you'll always be like 100th in the chart in terms of games. You'll have the most downloads, but you won't have the largest GMV or the largest revenue. Right. And I personally feel that most developers that we speak to, I think we did this analysis, there are now 600 studios in India. 3 years back, there were 250, including indies. Right. 30 studios have broken the $1 million ARR mark, which is great. In Turkey, it is 6 times of this.
Right.
Right. I feel like because of the single insight that Turkey also had, that let's not make games for Turkey. Because again, the Turkey ARPDAU is so low. Let's make games for the US market.
Yeah.
Right. And just by the way, one more myth I want to debunk. People believe that if you want to go to the US, you have to create an iOS game.
Right.
It's not true. I think Android is 35 to 40% of the US market. Right. So it's a huge market for Android. So you don't need iOS developers in India, which is a talent problem, to actually build for the US. Right. And I think that single insight is what we're now seeing studios say, that let's have a mix of US and India, or Norway and India, or Western Europe and India, because I want to create a $10 million game. Right. So I think the challenge that everyone's saying is, how do I make a $10 million revenue game on IAP and ads? And I think monetization is the singular thing that we have seen differentiates a really big developer from the rest. Because UA has become very standardized.
Right.
To a large extent, because the platforms, like you only have like 2 or 3 options: Apple Search Ads, Google, and Meta, right? And maybe Unity and AppLovin, but like largely you have 3 or 4 platforms, and they've kind of, let's be honest, they've black boxed the ecosystem, and I don't see that changing because they're making a lot of money that way. So the trick really, I think the difference really lies in the engagement and monetization part of the journey for the developer, right? And like you said, of course, passionate gaming and creating the creativity part of gaming will continue to exist, but I see that as the least differentiating point in this whole journey. Because today developers have access to Sensor Tower, Data.ai, all the popular mobile intelligence platforms. Everyone is seeing that the games that are being made are kind of replicas of each other at a level, right? So a certain studio will make a core loop, and then they will just keep making games on that core loop with minor modifications, because the diminishing cost of creating the game is really beneficial to
Right.
them. What they've cracked is the product data analysis and the monetization side of things, right? And I think you hit the nail on the head by saying that if India has that team, probably VCs would also be like, we can become like a $10 billion market from India, no matter where the audience is, right? That doesn't really matter.
Let's just probably manage some time on the monetization bit, right?
Sure.
So classically, you've had your in-app purchases, which is fairly well understood, I guess, at this point in time. And then there is the ads opportunity, which is traditionally been seen as a category which is not really positive to player engagement and experience, but
Yeah.
recently being debunked that that's not necessarily the case, right?
Thank God.
You've had,
Thank God for that.
you also have subscription revenues, which really
Yeah.
sort of contribute to some amount of business, including battle pass
Correct.
type models,
Yeah.
right? How should a founder or an early stage person looking at this industry and the monetization opportunity really start thinking about this, right?
Yeah.
If you could walk me through in terms of the specific approach to build out a fairly robust and diversified monetization profile for the specific game that you're talking about.
Yeah.
What the process look like?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I think most developers who have been in the industry for a long time do not like ads, right? There's just this perception. And I think it's also extended to some stakeholders like VCs. Like they don't like ads. I think now that's changing. They're realizing that ads is a growing part of the ecosystem. So the open internet, which is known as like all this combination of mobile apps and websites, is actually now as large as the closed or Chinese walled garden internet, which is like your TikToks, Instagrams, Google search, so on and so forth, right? I think that's just going to grow because this content is just growing, right?
Yeah.
More creators are coming. So I think now, firstly, everyone has realized ads is a part of the business model. It is not a annoyance. It is not a secondary monetization model. In some cases, it is the model, right? And I think that shift of mindset was important because now more founders are saying, okay, I'm comfortable now, because to create an IAP or subscription business is extremely hard because you have to convince the user twice. Once to download your app, second to pay for something in your app.
Right.
In the ads business, you only have to make one decision point. Download my app, use it, don't worry about it, ads is happening up now, right? So my advice to a founder would be that now debunk the myth in your head. If you ever thought that ads is not good, or VCs don't like ads, or like people don't like ads, or like you look at your store reviews, people come to us and say, hey, people wrote in my store review that I don't like ads. That is like 0.1% of your entire reviews, and we always tell people just A/B test how many users are actually uninstalling.
Yeah,
it's usually like 0.1, 0.2%, right? So first, ads is very much a sexy model, right? And I think people have realized that. So advise founders, first build that into your mindset. Second, once you've got that into your mindset, build in ads into your gameplay. We've seen a lot of developers that we work with now trying to force fit ads into an existing game. That is very, very hard, right? Because the user has gotten used to a certain way of playing your game. He or she doesn't want to suddenly see a rewarded ad pop up or an interstitial ad pop up, right? So from day one, if you have got the kind of user who's okay with ads and is retaining on your app, you know that user is okay with ads and he'll keep giving you money through ads, right? So I think that's the second thing that I would advise. Third, you have to look at user geos. So you have to do, before you launch your game, you have to realize that your game might be popular in many countries. We look at people who say that, I think I'm building my game for India. I think I'm building my game for Southeast Asia. I think mera game US mein chalega. But there are 150 other countries which have very high CPM,
right?
Which you're not looking at. Maybe you only get 500 installs, right? Like I spoke about Norway. Norway, you can get a $60 CPM from a rewarded ad. So even if you get 100 users, you're going to make much more money than you're making from 10,000 installs in India, right? So user geo is the second thing that I would say, right? So first is your mental mindset. Ads are good. Second is build in ads into day one into your gameplay. Third, look at where your user geos are, right? And I think this is a mistake a lot of developers make. They distribute where they are based. They think this game is, I'm in Dubai, so this game is from Middle East. But this game is actually could be played in Spain. So I'll give an excellent example. Ludo King is obviously really popular in India. But the second movers said, is Ludo popular in Spain? A lot of people in Spain play Ludo.
Right.
It's not intuitive.
Yeah.
But when they decide to just open up the market, they realize my IAP revenue from Europe on Ludo is higher than my IAP revenue from India. Right? So user geo needs to be experimented with. The third thing I would say is monetization is we're definitely moving to more premium formats. I think gone are the days of just relying on your banners, right? They
or
become kind of interstitial. No, I would argue interstitial is very much hot still. But banner blindness is becoming a larger problem in the industry, right? Advertisers also saying, hey, banners are just like banners. But if you have a full screen ad on a nice phone, like an interstitial or rewarded, it's hard to ignore. So you've got the full attention of the user on, let's say, an Amazon ad, and advertisers are willing to pay a premium for that. So premium geos, premium formats. And then lastly, tools. I think there's abundant knowledge of which tools are already used by the top developers, right? And I can name a few. So if you're creating Unity or Unreal, right? If you're using ads, you start with AdMob, AppLovin, IronSource, Meta. These are the four. So if you look at the split of the ad revenue pie today, 60 to 70% in casual gaming is Google. 12% Meta, the rest AppLovin, Unity. So you don't need to really think. You know what you got to put. You got to put these SDKs and work with them, right? In terms of IAP, you have two stores. You have the App Store and you have the Play Store. Within that, you got to figure out your data science, and that's it. So if you're a game developer today, your business part of it has actually been sorted by platforms because they're desperate to try and sell their business to you, right? I think as a developer, you've got to focus more on doing your research on where my game is popular and where does the unit economics actually work out, and then is my game an ads game? Is it an IAP game? Is it a hybrid game? And then just like you said, just 5 years is execute.
Yeah.
Right. Don't worry. Just don't worry. Don't worry that he's doing better, she's doing better. Just execute. Right. And you'll be successful. We've seen developers when I started out 3-4 years back in Google, who had built one game making $10 a day. Now they're making $1 million a year. And developers who didn't stick to it, they just kind of dropped off. These developers have suddenly grown really fast.
Yeah.
Because they just found that one thing that worked for their game. And now they're $1 million studio. I mean, what a story. I look at them and it's like super inspirational. Right. So that would be my advice. It's not complicated. It's a lot of years of learning I've crunched in, but all the tools are out there.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think great advice for any game developer who's listening in. And thank you so much, Ashish, for really sharing your insights deeply into the space and talking about the business of distribution of games, right? Thank you so much. And
before we wind up, I would have one question. One of the things that I get asked a lot, and since I have the opportunity to sit with, with
Go
Matrix,
for it.
is what's the dry powder right now? What's the appetite for VCs as a whole ecosystem for Indian developers? Right, this is something that a lot of people ask me.
Yeah.
Especially since India is a non-gaming developer market. We have 50,000 folks who have all the tools and capital to actually build games.
Yeah.
But they just don't know how to. One of the key things they're looking for is, can I get funding from a Matrix or a Sequoia or like a Lumicai or whatever it is, right?
Right.
What's the dry powder?
Right. No, I think that's a fair question. And to the first part, right? Is there dry powder? Absolutely yes. Right. Yeah. There is clearly capital on the sidelines, and there is very clearly a high degree of intent to deploy that capital. And this is true not just for funds like us, but pretty much across the spectrum, right? Because of the macro conditions, you definitely do see some degree of slowdown in the broader growth segment investments in gaming.
Sure.
But that doesn't necessarily reflect on the Indian ecosystem, which is still quite nascent, still growing at a phenomenal pace, and there is no real reason why a VC wouldn't take a conversation with a developer, given that you have built enough amount of progress into the business that you're trying to make.
Yeah.
You would definitely be able to get a conversation, right? So I don't think access to
capital is the
VCs or the conversations itself are necessarily a problem, right? Where a lot of struggle ultimately lies is to really cross the line in terms of, hey, is this a commercially viable thing, or is it more of a hobby project, which tends to be the case for a lot of developers, which is perfectly fine, but that might not necessarily be commercially viable enterprises which will become value drivers. Right?
Got it.
So having that mindset definitely helps for sure. But to the original question, there is absolutely.
Do you think it's more than $100 million?
Yeah, I think we could safely say that enough amount of capital as much as required would probably be able to come into the market. And you would see much more exciting news coming on that front in terms of funding coming in, not just from us, but also from our fraternity.
So good time to be a game developer.
Good time to be a gaming developer, and excellent time to be a game developer.
Great,
right?
awesome. So get funded by Matrix and then come to AppBroda and we'll help you. No, it's a shameless sales pitch, but no, thanks so much for this opportunity, Vivek.
No,
it was great catching up.
Yeah.
I think, I think gaming, and especially we haven't talked about non-gaming developers. They contribute a big part of this ecosystem, right? And I think one of the things I'm most excited about is this inflection point of them building games. I've seen like especially in Gujarat, I'll double click Gujarat here. The appetite to create and scale, once they figure it out, we leave all the other countries far behind.
Yeah.
Far behind, right?
Yeah.
So I think just this education thing is, something I'm so excited about. So really thank you for this opportunity for speaking about this.
No, thank you so much. Thank you so much, and hoping that you'll come back very soon on another episode of Matrix Moments.
Sure.
Thank
Yeah.
you everyone for joining in.
Thanks.